Good afternoon, everybody. It is officially afternoon. My name is Ron Sanders. I'm a vice president here at Booz Allen Hamilton and a fellow. And it's my pleasure and privilege to serve as the MC for today's inaugural edition of the National Intelligence University Foundation Speaker Series. First, let me thank you all and welcome you on behalf of the Foundation, NIU, and Booz Allen. A great crowd for, I think, what will be a great event. I said this is the inaugural event for the NIU Foundation Speaker Series. I'm not sure how many of you know about either, but one of our aims today is to make you aware of both NIU Foundation and the Speaker Series, because we hope that this is just the first of many events. I'm going to introduce the chairman of the NIU Foundation here in just a moment, and he'll tell you a little bit more about that. But first, let me provide some context for today's event. So, 10 years ago next week, President Bush signed something called the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, IRTPA, or for those of us who were charged with implementing it, IRTPA, until someone said it sounded like you had indigestion. Part of our nation's response to 9/11, it was perhaps the most sweeping legislation to impact the intelligence community ever. And we thought it would be fitting to commemorate the anniversary with a candid look back by some of the key figures who had a role in its creation and its implementation. And interestingly enough, one guy sort of played the role all through that. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. First, let me introduce the chairman of the National Intelligence University Foundation and my boss on several occasions, much to his chagrin, the Honorable Mike McConnell. Mike recently and allegedly retired as vice chair of Booz Allen Hamilton, but before that he served a long and storied career in the intelligence community, culminating with the position. He was the second director of national intelligence in our nation's history. Years from now, when we look back at that, that's quite an event. A little bit about Mike's background. Sometime in the last century, as a brand new one-star, Mike served as the J2 for Colin Powell in the first Gulf War. He actually became something of a media celebrity. President Bush rewarded him for that faithful service by giving him his third star and naming him director of the National Security Agency. Note that he went from 1 to 3. He skipped 2. That's quite an accomplishment. Not very often does that happen. He served there until '96. He left NSA for a senior position at Booz Allen Hamilton, where he built our cyber and intelligence business, at least until he was called back by President Bush to serve as the second DNI. He served in that position from 2006 to 2009, and he did, in my humble opinion, he did great things there. So please join me in welcoming the Honorable Mike McConnell.
Ron, thank you so much for that very, very kind introduction, but I have a question. Why do you always emphasize long and distinguished and long? So we're going to have to work around that a little bit. Let me welcome you. Thank you for being here. You remember the line in Casablanca? I'm shocked there's gambling going on in this place, and he said, round up the usual suspects. Well, when I look out on this audience, I see many of the usual suspects, but thank you for being here. As Ron mentioned, this is our first event for the National Intelligence University Foundation, and I want to tell you a little bit about the background here. Many of us have had the view that we should create such an organization for the community, very similar to the National Defense University for the military. The whole sense of the idea was to make it a place to aspire to promote collaboration and jointness. And in August of 2011, that vision came to fruition when the Secretary of Defense and the DNI officially agreed to create NIU for the entire intelligence community, not only the military, which had been served largely by DIA in the past, but also for the civilian community. And it was more than just a name change. It decreed a place for the community to have this place of higher learning and continuing education. Now, I think that's very important because the intelligence community has lacked such an institution for its entire existence, not like the service war colleges or the National Defense University for more on the joint side. So I think it's an exciting development. I think it will mature in time. They have a new campus in Bethesda, and we're all excited about standing that up at some point in the future. Yeah, I think it's exciting for old guys like Ron Sanders and current guys like many of you in the room, new people who are coming into the community like those at NIU today, and perhaps most importantly for the future. And the person leading that, I want to recognize Rear Admiral, Doctor, and educator David Ellison, sitting right here in front. David, if you just... A former naval surface warfare officer, was the president of Naval Postgraduate School out in Monterey, that wonderful place, and we were able to persuade him to serve as the president of NIU and standing it up. Now, anytime you have an event like this, there is a but however. And here's the but however. If you are a government institution, you are authorized to do things, and there's an appropriation to allow you to do that. The appropriation pays for it, and then there's an authorization to do it. And there are very strict rules overseen by a number of organizations to ensure you only do what you're authorized to do. So the restrictions on how you would spend those appropriate funds. Many universities, most universities, all universities have some support mechanism for doing things to support the activities of the university. And NIU had none. And so in 2011, a group of us came together to decide we should create such an organization. Our purpose, our single purpose, is to support NIU in things they can't do for themselves. They cannot spend, for example, appropriated funds to provide refreshments for the families coming to see the graduates graduate, which in my view is a tragedy, but those are the rules. So we have made every effort to create the foundation as a nonprofit charitable organization for which contributions are tax deductible, and to try to provide this level of support. In another thing that NIU cannot do is to work the alumni, and so we have an ongoing effort so we can build an alumni network to be a source of continuing support for the university. A group of us came together, and I mentioned in 2011, there are 20 board members. We were supported by Steve Ritchie. Steve, raise your hand. This foundation would not exist without Steve Ritchie. He is a member of AFCEA. AFCEA gave us money to start, and you will see here that AFCEA is a foundation founder, and they provide office space for us, and they host the meetings and keep the minutes and making all this work. We have other founders who stepped up to be sponsors, and they're listed here. Who's Alan Hamilton, who's hosting the activity today, CACI, or those who are competitors of CACI, CACI as we refer to them, and Excellus. They've all made a contribution, substantial contribution, and pledged to continue that over a 5-year period. And we have asked other corporations to have a similar consideration on our behalf. The website for you to be associated with this foundation is www.niuf.org. Very simple, www.niuf.org. I'd ask you to jot that down. What we hope to do is to have a growing alumni association. Half this audience today is somehow associated with the NIU or its predecessors. And I have a list here. I just want to give you a feel for it. I can come up with my list of the predecessor organizations. NDIC, the National Defense Intelligence College, that ran from 2006 to 2011. Joint Military Intelligence College, 1993 to 2006. The Defense Intelligence College, 83 to 93. And then way back there in the past, from 1962 to 83, the Defense Intelligence School, and yes, yours truly was a member of one of those classes. It was a great experience for me. That's why I believed so long in this standing up of NIU. We'd ask for your support, and we're going to have our first series here. And I just want to, they're going to be introduced with significant comment from our host. But I want to mention that Mike Hayden is a friend and colleague for a long time. I have the greatest respect for him. We had a situation where I served as a DNI and he was the director of CIA, and I think, at least in the words of President Bush, we made it work. And I believe he is a great colleague and a great American. The other person that's going to be involved has more to do with the passing of the law that created the DNI and restructured the community than most people appreciate. A White House staffer to whom I'm forever indebted, because with a grumpy Congress, he managed my confirmation to get me through. It's Michael Allen, and Michael Allen has written the seminal book, not only on this legislation, but how does the process work? How do you understand the debate and the compromise and the dialogue and the activities for creating something like a new government institution? The name of the book is Blinking Red. If you care about this community at all and you haven't read that book, you've done yourself a disservice. It's available on Amazon. The author is Michael Allen, and the name of it is Blinking Red. And I hope the next time you see we run into each other at one of these events, you say, you know, I read that book, and you're right. It's great. So let me turn it back over to Ron. Thank you all for coming, and I hope there'll be many other events like this in the future. Thank you very much.
Mike, thanks. All right, here's the plan for the day. I'll officially introduce our two featured guests here in a moment. They'll join us up here. General Hayden will set the stage, set the context. He'll spend a few minutes with some opening remarks. Then he and Michael Allen will engage in a dialogue, sort of an informal interview. This will not be Geraldo. And then as a third segment, we'll open it up for questions from the audience. In order to maximize the number of questions and to keep consistent with our format, here are the rules of engagement for the questions. You've got 3x5 cards in front of you. If you have a question, write it down, raise your hand, or send it to the aisle on your right. We'll have somebody there to collect them. And then Steve and I will feed them to Michael. And Michael will then integrate them into the dialogue he's having with General Hayden. So I hope that works. We appreciate your flexibility in doing that. All right, now for our featured guests. As Mike McConnell noted, Michael Allen wrote Blinking Red, but that's not his only claim to fame. He's managing director of something called Beacon Global Strategies. And he actually came at Blinking Red from a long and distinguished career in his own right in the national security and intelligence business. He directed the successor to the 9/11 Commission. He served as a senior White House staffer during some tumultuous years in the first decade of the 21st century, including senior director on the NSC staff for counterproliferation strategy. He also served as senior director for legislative affairs, where he not only got Mike McConnell confirmed, but John Negroponte and Mike Hayden as principal director in the early days of ODNI. So, Michael, thanks for agreeing to do this. And then General Hayden. I have to tell you, just as an aside, it's a privilege for me because a couple of my heroes are up here speaking, and he's one of them. Retired Air Force 4-star general. He, too, has a long and storied career in American intelligence. An Air Force intelligence officer, President Bush named him, actually President Clinton, named him director of the National Security Agency in 1999, and he served there until 2006. In that capacity, as he will share with you, he was a key figure in the run-up to IRTPA, involved in some fairly significant discussions that frankly took quite a lot of courage. You've heard of speaking truth to power. You'll hear some examples of that this afternoon. As a reward, I guess, President Bush named him the first principal deputy director of national intelligence. We used to call him P. Diddy, not a rap star, Mike. He served in that position from 2005 to 2006. That's where I had the privilege of working for him. I was actually OD&I employee number 9, and the job interview I had with Mike was surreal. I don't know if you remember that, but that's another story I won't bore you with. Mike has been sequestered in anonymity ever since. However, he's agreed to re-enter the limelight this afternoon to share some of his thoughts and experiences with us today. Michael and Mike, please join me in welcoming them.
Thanks so much for the introduction and to be here for such a worthy cause. And thanks to Admiral McConnell and everyone else for hosting us today. I think what we're going to do first is ask and invite General Hayden to give some introductory remarks, and then I will ask you a few questions.
Okay, thanks. Well, great to be here. Great to be anywhere. I loved the Admiral's introduction, the usual suspects. If you worked for me at either three-letter agency, you probably are. PDD&I. Great job, only 1 year, but it did give me a chance to look at the transition. And I've really tried to step back from it. I'm not going to take up a lot of time here, but Michael and Ron have asked me to kind of lay some groundwork. This has never been a struggle with the forces of light versus the forces of darkness. It's never really been about bureaucratic turf. Frankly, it's never really been about competence or incompetence. I mean, we have all been part of a very complex organization. And all complex organizations have an internal struggle between two things, both of which are virtues. Unity of effort for the whole, autonomy of action for the parts. And college faculty, corporation, American intelligence community, same dynamic. And the point is, they're both virtues. You want them both, but you need to keep them in balance. And balance is pretty much defined as, that fulcrum for where balance is broadly defined by the totality of circumstances in which you find yourself. There is no absolute point on where the fulcrum need be. It can shift over time. The judgment made after 9/11 was that we had too much autonomy of action and not enough unity of effort. I think a lot of us who were playing ball then felt that probably wasn't nearly as true as the Congress thought it was, that we actually had a fair amount of unity of action. I tell the story that, frankly, I got called by George Tenet 10 times as often as I got called by any combination of people in the Department of Defense. Okay? And George would always begin, Mike, my guys were just in here, and here's what I want you to do. So there was unity of effort. Fair case, Congress said not enough. Disagree with the diagnosis, but we're going to go change. We're going to go change it. I think the methodology by which they attempted to change it, and I think the Admiral agrees with me here, actually gave the center, and we renamed the center from DCI to DNI, but actually gave the center fewer tools than the center used to have when the center was the DCI. The DNI actually had less in his rucksack. Remember that conversation with George? Hey, Mike, my guys were just in here. The antecedent of guys was never the CMS staff. The antecedent of guys was the CIA staff. And the point I'm trying to make is that George Tenet created unity of effort by his relationship with George Bush, by his personal characteristics, and by the fact he headed the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, we're going to go do something different. The purpose, again, now, we need more unity of effort, too much autonomy. And we're going to create a new guy in the center. And the one thing we are guaranteeing in statute he will not be is the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And so the thought we had is you better put a lot of bricks in this guy's rucksack. Because the one thing that gave George power, informal power admittedly, but the one thing that gave him power was the fact that he was heading up CIA. And so we transfer with a diagnosis that frankly was questionable, but I could understand, with a prescription that actually probably started us off further back in terms of what it is the legislation wanted to achieve than we were with the status quo ante. And so I think since then, the struggle has been for the DNIs to actually accrue the kind of influence and synchronization over the community that the last DCI had. And it's been a struggle. Now, Mike, I know you talk about Secretary of Intelligence, the department that you were playing with cards in your hand that you thought you needed. When Jim got named DNI, I mean, the weekend he was named, the job was downscoped. 3 things happened that weekend. Number one, the president goes out in the Rose Garden with Jim and his grandkids and says, here's the new DNI, and he's going to be really great at it because he was the USDI, and as USDI, he was running 4 or 5 of those big agencies already, which, if anyone understands the plumbing, ain't a good sentence coming out from the president. Then the Sunday morning newspaper talked about the president's key, Washington Post, above the fold, the president's key intelligence advisor. True story, all in a weekend. There was a story about Jim Clapper, a story about John. Then later that day, Bob Gates goes to the back of the aircraft to the press pool in a trip out of Kazakhstan. And clearly, since he's speaking in whole paragraphs, he just didn't get ambushed while he was getting another drink. He wanted to go back and talk. And he said, you know, he's really not like a CEO. He's kind of like a powerful committee chairman on the Hill. And so there was indeed a downscoping. Now, I think Jim's done very well. And downscoping may have been what was needed at the time. But you see the dynamic we have underway here. All right, this is not a permanent solution. I already suggested that fulcrum point moves based upon externalities. I guess I'll end, Michael, because I promised not to go too much longer. I guess I would end with, despite what I just said, I don't know of anybody who actually understands much of this who thinks we should go back to the Hill and have them lift up the hood and start pulling out carburetor wires again. That we can make this work. All right? This system is not so difficult that we cannot make it succeed. Now, it needs 3 things to succeed. One is the quality of the DNI. Right? And it requires not just a tremendously talented person, but a peculiarly talented person. I'll be very candid with you. Denny Blair was tremendously talented, but he wasn't peculiarly talented. It wasn't the right skill set for the job. So that's one. Second is the relationship of the DNI to the president. And it has got to be like that. Everyone's got to believe that he actually is the guy the president turns to. And then the third, and the Admiral and I experienced this, the third is the relationship of the DNI to the DCIA. And frankly, the DNI owes the DCIA some space, and the DCIA owes the DNI total transparency. And if you can get that, if you can get those 3 things right, the right person is the DNI, the relationship with the president, and finally the relationship along Route 123, this is fine. Okay? It really is. By the way, you realize on the 10th of September 2001, we had the most integrated intelligence community on the planet, right? I mean, you do recognize that. And if God and the American public were still grading on the curve, we'd still be getting our gentleman name. But after 9/11, they decided we need to go to an absolute scale and need to do some things better. So I guess I'll end by saying we're actually pretty good at what we do. We're actually a pretty successful intelligence community. And this, you know, we'll turn a couple of the screws here and maybe tighten up that bolt and loosen up that one a little bit. And we're bright people, and we'll get on with it. But it does require those 3 characteristics of the DNI, the president, and the DCIA's relationship to make the current plumbing work. I'm sorry, I got to have one more thing. There are some byproducts of this that are unarguably blessings. One is NCTC. Okay? The NCTC can't exist under the old structure. No way does American political culture put this blend of foreign and domestic law enforcement and intelligence under the guy running the nation's human service in his other hat. That just never happens. I also think it has liberated the DCIA. I used to compare my work day to Mike's, and at 10 o'clock when he's crawling out of the SUV for the third time, getting back to his office, I've been director of CIA for 4 hours. That's a big deal. Okay, that's enough.
No, that was fascinating and previewed a lot of the issues I want to raise with you. Let's begin by taking you back to just after 9/11. The 9/11 Commission, of course, recommended that we needed a quarterback, someone that could break stovepipes, force information sharing, created Goldwater nickels for the intelligence community. But I think the most salient criticism of the 9/11 Commission report was that it took a snapshot of the integration and reform of the intelligence community as of September 10th, 2001, and then made their recommendations in July of 2004. And the reason that was a flaw, I think, was because this was the most transformative period in U.S. intelligence in many, many decades. Can you, and I don't mean just detainees and the terrorist surveillance program, but tell us a little bit what it was like to be NSA director after 9/11 and what happened to begin the process of reflecting on what went wrong on 9/11 and how do we improve it?
A couple of things immediately come to mind, and kind of stream of consciousness, so forgive me. Number one, war has a cleansing effect on your attitude. You really get focused. And things that were really important on Monday, on the 10th, on the 12th, you could discard them and get on with really core issues. So that's really important. Number two, I'm fond of telling the story that when I was DCIA, I had $2 for every $1 George Tenet had on September 10th. That is also powerfully enabling.
Right.
Right? And so, a lot of things that, the mantra out there was turf and bureaucracy and hiding the ball and failure to share. Actually, the reality is it's just hard to do.
Right.
And it gets easier when you're allowed to focus on a specific objective, and it gets easier when you've got resources that you can then begin to move around. And then finally, there were impediments that were quickly removed. Remember the whole pre-9/11 wall, law enforcement, intelligence, foreign and domestic. Those went away.
Those disappeared.
Yeah.
You, and we'll get to this shortly, were one of the most famous dissenters from the 9/11 Commission approach and what President Bush ultimately recommended. But before we get to your views in the summer of 2004, what were your views of the community before then? You just said nice things about Tenet and his role as DCI, but did you have a view then that true intelligence reform would mean that the NSA, NGA, and NRO, for example, would be under the authority, direction, and control of a Secretary of Intelligence or a DNI?
Yeah, and look, so the formula is this. Again, back to my premise, I actually thought we were fairly well integrated. Get better, of course, all right? And frankly, I've shared this with the Admiral before, I don't know how George Tenet ever had any time to be DCI. Right? So I get that division of labor problem. But there was significant unity of effort. On a global scale, compared to anybody else, come up afterwards and tell me who's doing it better on September 10th. And don't mention the Israelis, because I know how those guys treat one another. Okay? So we were actually fairly well integrated then. And then with the purpose, the wind in our back with war and focus and additional money, I actually thought we were in pretty good shape. Now, as I said, we're going to go do a do-over here. We're going to rewire it, and we were going to make sure the center. By statute, the DNI couldn't even have his office at Langley, let alone be the DCIA. And so what we were going to do was to take that which created the glue, that which generated the centripetal forces, and take it away from the guy in the center.
Right.
And so if you're going to take away the sources of informal authority, then you had to replace it, back to my bricks in the rucksack model. You had to throw a lot of bricks of formal legislative authority into the rucksack. Otherwise, you're going to end up with the center less empowered than they were. Now, I understand that was informal power, but if you're going to take that source away, then you had to put formal power in. So when Jim and I went to the SecDef,
well, we're going to get to that.
okay. Well, the point was, we'd rather not do this. But if you do it,
right,
you got to be all in. Otherwise, and the word we used was a feckless head of the community.
Let me try one more thing on you before we get to this. So you've been complimentary of Director Tennant and his role, and obviously he has a tremendous force of personality and a bond with President Bush, and you're complimentary of his ability to manage the community. But what about previous DCIs, as far as you were concerned, and even during the Tennant era, were there things that you wish the DCI could have been able to pull off on behalf of the community that it couldn't for whatever statutory reasons existed?
I don't know, Michael, man. I just had an agency then, full-time day work, and focused on that. Let me relate something to you, though, that actually indirectly answers your question. Ron mentioned I was selected to be the Dernza by President Clinton. Let me tell you my interview process to get that job. I flew back from Korea, was thrown in the back of an SUV out of Boeing, driven across the Bay Bridge, and interrupted George attending the Netanyahu-Arafat summit at Y River Plantation. I sat there in one of the outbuildings. George finally came in. We had an interview. I went on to Geneva for 4 party talks and then back to Seoul where I was working. I'm done. That's the interview process to be the director of the National Security Agency. The only person I talked to was the DCI.
Interesting.
Okay?
Yeah.
And that's what I'm suggesting. I've got a narrow window on this, all right? I'm in Korea, for God's sake. But when I came back, it was the DCI picking me. I didn't go down and talk to Secretary Cohen or Secretary Hamry or DCI.
Gotcha. So for the 9/11 Commission report, you referred to this a little bit. There was obviously some CIA animus in President Bush's first term as a result of Iraq and 9/11, and I sort of documented in the book all the nasty things people said about the Central Intelligence Agency. And so I think that motivated a little bit of this statutory provision that said you shall not have or locate the DNI on Langley, Virginia. But I feel like the 9/11 Commission knew that they were doing something that potentially would disadvantage the center, because not many people remember because it was dismissed so quickly, but they recommended that the ODNI be in the executive office of the president. They wanted the reflective glory or the reflected power of the commander-in-chief to accrue to the new director of national intelligence. And later, Lee Hamilton later said, I was worried, the reason we did this is we didn't want the DNI left off in left field or something by himself. Maybe he had in mind hanging out at Liberty Crossing with no real connective tissue to any of the other community. What's your view of whether the White House would have been helped and how much we disadvantaged? Okay.
I have history.
Yeah.
We did that for the first 2 years of the Obama administration.
Interesting. Yeah.
The de facto DNI was John Brennan.
Was the community work better?
In the White House. No.
Okay.
No. And in fact, John's heavy load he had when he went to DCI was breaking the umbilical, at least the perceived umbilical, back to the White House. That he wasn't the agency's representative to the White House, but the other way around. And that would have continued to grow either in this informal structure in which John was the de facto DNI, in the executive office of the president, or if he'd have gone to the formal structure, where you put him down there in the executive office of the president. I think it's a pretty strong word, but I think it corrupts his autonomy. Mm-hmm. It corrupts his independence. And so I know why the commission decided, no, we can't do that. And I think it's an interesting sidebar of history that we kind of did for the time Denny Blair was the DNI.
So the commission's lines were, and which were largely adopted by the Congress, was basically he who has the gold rules and he who can hire and fire will be that those are the true maxims that dominate Washington. I think you saw through that. I think you thought that that was an insufficient amount of power for the Director of National Intelligence. But what exactly and when did you take a look at the 9/11 Commission recommendations and say to yourself, God, this is not going to work?
It wasn't so much the recommendation. I already told you, based on a misdiagnosis, we actually had some glue. We're in the middle of a war. There's going to be this bathtub capacity and capability while we make the transition, even if it were a good idea. And so for all those reasons, I'm kind of opposed to it. Where it really got tough, Michael, was I actually do think hire fire and move the money is a very powerful tool. And the kind of thing you need one of those bricks you got to put in the backpack. They didn't. That was not in the statute.
They didn't substantially increase.
They did not substantially increase those powers.
Right.
And so back again, okay, you're losing the informal power, you got to put the formal power in. What's formal power? Okay, hire and fire, that's pretty good. Move the money, not bad. But fundamentally, they didn't put them in his repertoire. Now, there's language about the DNI able to move X number of dollars and so on. But then there's Section 1018,
yes, sir,
which simply says, whatever it is we're telling you this guy can do, he's not allowed to screw up the authority of the secretaries of the cabinet departments in which the intelligence community organizations are located.
So Vice President Cheney and Don Rumsfeld were vociferous opponents of any change in the status quo. I think they saw it as a zero-sum game of any transfer of authority, be it to a DCI or a new DNI, would be a loss for their authority under Title X over the combat support agencies. Right. Take us a little bit through this famous dissent.
Yeah.
That this is, I think, sort of rather remarkable. Two of Secretary Rumsfeld being no shrinking violet, and two of his most senior intelligence people, the head of NSA and the head of NGA, don't like where the Secretary has come down and really mount sort of a guerrilla lobbying campaign on the Hill and in the White House against where they see things going, which is toward a DNI.
Feckless DNI.
So take us a little bit why you felt so strongly and what you and Director Clapper did.
Sure. It's very straightforward, Michael, and it's built upon what I've said. We didn't want to take this train, but this train was going.
Right.
And so if this train is going, then we're going to end up in a that's a good word. We're going to end up in a worse place than we were, because they weren't creating the tools. They were misreading the situation, and therefore you had to give strong statutory authority to the DNI, and clearly that was going to be somewhat at the real or perceived expense of the SecDef. I mean, the Attorney General pretty much didn't give a damn, all right? But the SecDef did, and that's what this was all about. And so Jim and I are pushing, if you're going to do this, we don't think you should, but I know you're going to do it. So if you're going to do it, you got to do a lot. You got to put stuff in here. And that was our argument. So Jim and I did that privately with Steve Cambone in a closed session of the HPSI. And then we went over to Y River, one of Nolte's totally off the record, don't worry about it, say what you speak from the heart. Nobody's going to take notes or tell anybody meetings. Which we did, and before I crossed the Bay Bridge, Secretary of Defense knew that Hayden and Clapper were off the reservation. So we got invited to lunch. I remember the scene. It was tacos and other Mexican deal. SecDef, Secretary Wolfowitz, Pete Pace, Steve Cambone, Hayden, Clapper. I was a negotiator at Panmunjom. It looked like T2 at Panmunjom. You know, didn't have the flags, but pretty much that was it. And it's actually very complimentary. I thought you people were smart. That's how we kind of began the conversation. And Jim and I went through the drill, pretty much what we just said. Jim actually spoke more forcefully than I did about structural. He actually said, you may have to consider moving these organizations out. He actually put that on the table. I'm thinking. At the end, as we were leaving, I said, Mr. Secretary, we're heading for a bad train wreck unless you can see your way to be generous. Was the last thing I said. Then we left. To be fair to Secretary Rumsfeld, and I only learned about this, I'm trying to copy Michael and write a book too, and I'm doing research, and Steve Cambone said something to me that I should have realized, all right, because it makes so much sense. But he said the Secretary's view was simply this: what can a DNI do that a DCI cannot if the President wants the DCI to do it? That's a really good question.
That is.
And so he's back to this trip isn't necessary. And that's actually a very, very powerful statement.
What about the argument, just to press you on, so you and Clapper and ultimately John McLaughlin start advocating within the interagency for something akin to a Secretary of Intelligence, where you move the combat support agencies directly. What about the counter-argument that we've heard so often that, well, the Department of Defense was going to replicate all of these functions if you ripped them out of the Department of Defense? Is that true, and is that a reason not to do it?
It's not a reason not to do it. It's semi-true. There's a resource question here. And I think the defense customer is never satisfied. Okay. Everyone's nodding, okay. And so there's always this, you're not giving me all you got. Mm-hmm. Okay? And so you'd have to work your way through that. I actually think, now I'm being a little self-referential here, I actually think NSA through 01, 02, 03, Iraq, Afghanistan, got downright awesome in its combat support role. We're pushing, our kind of contract with the national, and first initial, National Security Agency was probably down to the JTF level is where we should be directly providing product. We were down to brigade and regiment, within a year of the war starting in Iraq. We were really, really, really well integrated. We had Marine radio tuning satellites, to cover targets in their immediate front. And I had guys at Fort Gordon tuning antennas on tactical vehicles. So it was so I actually think we're actually doing very, very well. So I think the argument would have been attractive, but I don't think it would have been substantiated that they had to go replicate this. And by the way, there are, I governed the CCP, the cryptologic program, but there was a DCP, there was a defense cryptologic program. Even with an NSA, there are rivet joints and Marine radio combat teams and a whole bunch of things in the Army.
So let me talk about CCP and your NSA. Most people have cited not the DNI or the NCTC as the most amazing things that the community's been able to pull off since 9/11. Some cite the Patriot Act and knocking down the wall. But I think as a result of your tenure and General Alexander's tenure, what I heard so often on the HIPC is that we were in the golden age of signals intelligence. How were we able to, and frankly, I remember reading in the WMD Rob Silberman report, it was critical of the NSA for not keeping up with the technological revolution in the late 90s and the rest, and the switch to fiber optics. Can you explain a little bit about how you were able to reform and rejigger the mission of the NSA to catch up?
Yeah, I feel like Carl Sagan, billions and billions. Okay. We just got money. Yeah. We knew. We had a couple of cultural issues. We were a very insular organization. NSA's famous for being inward turning, and for most of the life of the agency, it didn't matter because what they needed, they had to build themselves. But in the 90s, the IT explosion, the computing explosion outside the walls, the outside was going faster than the inside, and so we had to create a far more permeable membrane between inside and outside. That was a cultural question. Mm-hmm. But once we got beyond that, Michael, it was just investment. So 99, 2000, pre-war, I tried to move $200 million out of the CCP from current mission to invest in infrastructure to chase new signals. It was a knife fight all over town. I had to get on the State Department to defend weakening our coverage of Nigerian organized crime. Okay? It was that kind of thing. After 9/11, the money flowed. The focus, we were allowed to narrow our front. We were allowed to invest in the progress was made like that.
And we caught up. So The 9/11 Commission recommendations, I think, and have argued, set off one of the most amazing stampedes in congressional history, from sacrificing the sacrosanct August recess to have hearings all through August of summer of 2004, through marching through the Senate and the House of Representatives and signing a bill into law in December, so it comes out 6 or so months from start to finish. And I know what a big fan of congressional oversight you are.
Oh, yeah, I'm there.
And how well you, and how you impressed you are with the SISI and the HIPSI. But I wonder if you could comment a little bit on how you saw the legislative process unfold, particularly as it compared to Goldwater-Nichols, which is always cited as the model of legislative deliberation and success.
Well, I read your book, so correct me if I'm misremembering. The HIPSI and the SISI didn't have much to do with this, right?
SISI, almost nothing.
Yeah.
That's right.
I mean, this was not quite in regular order. This kind of caught fire over there with Collins and Lieberman.
Right.
And I guess government affairs.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. And so the intel guys are going, hey, look, what's going on?
Right.
It was a stampede. The report, clever move on the part of the commission to drop it at the height of the presidential campaign in the summer of 2004. About 20 minutes after the thing hits, candidate Kerry says, yep, that's the plan. I'm in favor of it. President Bush at least waited a decent interval to at least create the cover story. He may have read it. Okay. And then he came out in favor of it too.
Yep.
But it was inevitable. We got that WMD thing and the 9/11, but we don't really need to make. It was politically impossible not to support the change. Did you shepherd my PDD&I
Yes.
confirmation?
Yes.
Yeah, that was a parade of photo ops. All right, now we're not there to be DCIA. I'm getting beat up by, just about anybody in the Senate. But for the PDD&I, everybody wanted to have their picture taken with me or Negroponte.
Right.
Because
this is history here.
We're doing it.
Yeah.
And so it was a bit of stampede. Was it thoughtful? No. John McLaughlin has a wonderful phrase. He said he felt as if CIA were on a gurney, surrounded by a lot of people in white coats who were continually poking at the patient. And the patient could not see a medical degree anywhere on any of the walls. And so I think you come to this is kind of a semi-conclusion in your book was this could have been worse. This could have been a real train wreck given the dynamics that were afoot. And we end up in the place I already kind of gave you my macro judgment. Not good, but we can work with it. And so we'll move on.
So before we get to the...
you said Goldwater-Nichols.
Compared to that process.
Goldwater-Nichols
But you answered it.
Have been baking for years.
Right.
Everyone knew what that was going to do. The problem was the services didn't want it. But everyone knew, this was a bill we actually knew the contents of.
So before we get to the irony of you being a dissenter and becoming the first principal deputy director of D&I, Secretary Gates, well, at the time he was president of Texas A&M, but he was recruited.
He was offered the job.
Offered the job and ultimately turned it down to be D&I.
Because he did not think statutorily it had sufficient strength.
Exactly. So I found his emails to Andy Card at the time, and he called the bill, the ultimate statute, strange. And he said, who is going to tell Porter Goss that the D&I is the new chief at the NSC meetings and briefing the president in the morning? And citing the movie Highlander, he wrote to Andy Card, as in the movie Highlander, there can only be one. He said that Hadley and others tried to give him enough assurances where he thought he could do the job, but that he ultimately had to turn down the job because he didn't think the statutory authority was there.
Yep.
Did that enter into your mind when you were recruited to be PDD&I, you sort of didn't think it was going to work, but you went anyway.
No, it was, I knew the problem we had, all right? And so if it were going to work, at least there would be somebody advising John Negroponte who understood the reality and could try to push it in the right direction. Besides that, Mike, I've been at NSA for 6 years. And, you know, time to move on, I guess. Let someone else like Keith come on board. And so when it was Andy who called me, Andy Card, and made the offer, I said, sure, new challenge, could be interesting. And, you know, if I believed what I said, that this could be a real train wreck, then there was some responsibility to do what I could to prevent it.
So President Bush offered it to Gates and later Vernon Clark and maybe others, and stipulate that John Negroponte is one of the finest Americans and made tremendous contributions to our country. Was that, and forget about him as a person, was it the right profile for the first D&I to be from the Foreign Service?
It was okay, and here's the criteria I had. I actually thought about this because I didn't know. I mean, that one you just mentioned after Gates, I wasn't aware of. Okay, with Jordan, right?
Right.
Yeah. But I thought about, okay, who's going to have this job? And the criteria I simply had was when President Bush comes out to introduce the new D&I, most of America can't be looking at their TV saying, who's that with the president? The guy going out there had to be a recognized face with his own throw weight. Negroponte had that. And so that was fine. Now, that actually made it more, if you're asking about my own personal decision, that actually made it a bit more compelling for me, because as powerful an individual, as talented as an individual he was, he didn't know anything about the intel community.
Right. So your confirmation, Negroponte's confirmation, sailed through. You're in the job for a year. You've looked back at the statute, and you've already said, and I've agreed, that it only nominally increased the power of the budget for the D&I versus the DCI, only nominally increased the ability to influence the appointment authority of who the president was going to select, and didn't really give any new hiring and firing authority.
Right.
And then, of course, you mentioned 1018. Did you explain your tenure as the PDENI? Were you frustrated? Were there things that you wanted to accomplish that you were immediately unable to do? And how did it work?
Yeah, I made a list. I think I actually got up to 10 things. This is me at the desk, you know. And I won't remember most of them. But they were all these kinds of things. They were all exercise the right or create the right, you know, begin to do a track record. One I remember was, whoever it is, go prickly with the next nominee for whatever job, and the head of the 16 agencies show up. I mean, it could be St. Francis of Assisi. Be ornery about it. Say, I'm not so sure. And I'm saying reject it, but, you know, create a scene sufficient to have the cabinet secretary recognize that you have to be placated on this choice. That was one of them. The other one, more concrete. I walked into John, I walked in the ambassador and said, sir, I need you to move $20 million. Okay, Mike, what's the issue? I don't know. I just need you to move $20 million. And seriously, I said, you have got to move money. I'll find something. It'll look good, but you got to move $20 million. This is in a budget of what, $50 billion? Okay. But you got to move $20 million. Just do it. He wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. So that was kind of my drill. To be fair, though, I mean, what happened was John kind of played Mr. Outside. He usually went to the meetings, and I was kind of Mr. Inside, and I was kind of working the plumbing and so on. And I would just walk from office to office. We created offices. Ron just mentioned he was employee number 9 here, so we got an HR staff and so on. We were criticized for the size of our staff, but keep in mind, all the things George cheated on, not having on his CMS staff because he had it on his CIA staff. He had a massive legislative affairs office. He had a massive general counsel. He had a massive public affairs office. He didn't need that CMS-wise because he had it. We had to recreate it. So we began to create these different different offices. And I actually, Michael, with God as my judge, I just kind of walk down there with my Diet Coke, walk in and say, what the hell you do around here? And begin to elicit information of people, how they perceive their role and so on. We made a massive, massive tactical mistake. And it was beyond the field of view of David Shedd and Mike Leiter and me. Pat did it, Pat Kennedy. Pat did wonderful work just getting us set up mechanically. But Pat took the entire CMS staff en masse and rolled it in to the DNI billets. And we just, oh, God. I mean, all good people, and it's not a slam on people. These are people who, in essence, were working on a staff that on a good day was peripheral. And now we've put them under the guy who's supposed to make more glue and more centripetal forces. It was just inheriting and importing the wrong approach to everything. So that was a real unforced error. There was another unforced error. I got selected to be the director of CIA. Remember, Mr. Inside, Mr. Outside, Mr. Diplomat, Mr. Intel guy. I get selected to be DCIA, and my position stays vacant for a year.
Yeah.
Totally unforced error. I mean, what are you doing here? Okay, so we made this much harder than it should have been.
CIA did not have any influence during the legislative process, but arguably once the ODNI was set up, they sort of launched maybe the most successful covert influence campaign in their career, because everybody around Washington for years, the only thing they could say about ODNI was extra layer of bureaucracy that supplies no value. When Clapper...
Position I totally opposed until 26 May 2006.
Clapper said that the attitude at the Department of Defense, particularly in the USDI, before he took over, was outright hostility towards the ODNI. How much resistance...
Who was hostile, USDI or CIA?
USDI.
Yeah.
Clapper, I mean, well, he said that about Cambone's
Yeah.
tenure at USDI. And CIA was unquestionably hostile in labeling ODNI as a political imperative in the heat of an election campaign that supplies no value. How much of an obstacle was bureaucratic resistance to what you and Negroponte were trying to do?
So to run the tape back, pre-IRTPA, the Department of Defense gets the Armed Services Committees, not the Intel Committees, gets the Armed Services Committees to create a new position, the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. I understand why. I mean, you know, the good news is that Rumsfeld actually paid attention to Intel. My first meeting with him, he had been in the office, what's this, 2001 now, been in the office about 2 weeks. I go down for my first courtesy call. I start whipping out flip charts. You know, I'm going to tell you about your NSA here, Mr. Secretary. I get about one chart, and he says, who you work for? I go, you and George. He said, which line is dotted and which line is solid? I go, well, sir, they're both solid, and that would probably be tough for me if somebody down here paid attention to NSA. Bad move. But we were, okay, so he did pay attention. That was good. And then he wanted somebody he could turn to so he didn't have to run, govern, whatever verb you use, NSA, NGA, DIA. I want a guy. So I understand that, all right? He got his guy without coordinating with George. Mm-hmm. Okay? This was not just the Intel committees. He didn't tell the DCI. And now realize what just happened. You just put somebody between the DCI and a whole bunch of agencies whose first initial is N. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that was corrupting of strengthening the center. All right, so that, yeah. Now that said, I mean, yeah, I'm going to make this phone call before I cross the Bay Bridge, and I'll have to live with it the rest of my life. Okay, just like Clapper and my briefing out at Y River. But frankly, Steve was fine to get along with. Yeah. Steve didn't know a whole bunch about the community, so he kind of took on a role of communicator between the will of the secretary and the actions of the agencies. Jim knew more about the community and wanted to control more.
Right.
So, I mean, just telling you, Steve's getting a little bit of a bad rap here.
Sure.
And just in terms of how it worked, Steve was fine. So that's the USDI thing. The CIA thing was just out and out guerrilla warfare. All right, we had to depend. I mean, we used CWS. I mean, our wiring was CIA. Our logistics was CIA, and Dusty Fogel was the exter, and Dusty just threw obstacles in our way. I mean, it was just pure petulance.
Yeah.
You know, in terms of, you know, would we actually get security detail? Would we actually have vehicles to drive around in? We just did kind of routine things. When we said, I actually drafted it, and Ambassador Negroponte signed it. Hey, all you guys who are station chiefs, consider yourself, in addition to representing the DCIA, as representing the DNI as well. And Dusty tries to countermand it.
Yeah.
You know, so that was hard. I went, because I knew most of the guys, and I went and had a heart-to-heart with the leadership in the conference room at the CIA. And they knew me. I mean, you know, Dernza and in the meetings and all that. It was a hard meeting. I've written about this. I've used the word battered child syndrome for the agency, not just the leadership at that point. And they were, you know, pretty down about life in general. And I tried to explain to them, I said, look, guys, we're going to have to live with this. And I get it. We are on the same grid reference, all right? As a legislative matter, we're the center of the community. As a practical matter, you are. That's what the C stands for. So the only way we can survive is to separate it with same grid reference. So if we're going to prevent fratricide, we're going to have to separate ourselves in altitude. So I'll tell you what, we'll take all those higher order vague verbs like doctrine and direction, and you take all the lower order operational verbs like direct and operate and so on. And that was the approach I used.
Did it work?
You know, it was a work in progress. It was hard. It was very hard for the agency. Now, let me tell you, and this is before I had any inkling that I would be DCIA. Okay? When Negroponte would say, well, okay, now how many players we got? Well, 15 last count. You say, is that too many? No. Let me tell you, it works. And I do this chart where I put the service intel shops down here. Okay, and I said, invite them to the Christmas party. They'll be happy. Okay? And then I said, you got, well, come on. And then you got these 5 specialized things. They're not real big, but they're real important. You got to go to DOE for your nuclear stuff. You know, so they're important. Okay, so pay attention, but they're not going to take up a whole lot of time. Then you got these 6. Get these 6 right, it's all okay. Blow these 6, we're doomed. CIA, NSA, NGA, NRO, DIA, and the National Security Branch of FBI. And so for about 6-8 months as PDD&I, because of the legislation, but pretty much reflecting the way you just asked your last question, I treated CIA as being just like those other guys. And this, again, this is pre-DCIA time for me. I had no inkling. But I independently came to the conclusion CIA is not on that line. That C is still central, and that although they're all important, you can't quite group CIA in with the other 5. That there really has to, back to my explanation saying, I didn't say that Mike needed a special relationship with the Dernza, although that was good. The pass-fail was a special relationship with the DCIA. And that, so I would draw this chart, and then I'd have this kind of CIA box levitating, going up above the other 5, that you got to get these 6 right, otherwise it won't matter. But you got to get this one right, otherwise the other 5 won't matter. And that's how I view the community. So CIA was prickly and demanded more attention, but it wasn't just attitude. Structurally, it needed more attention.
I just want to remind the audience, if you have any questions, please send them on up, and we've got about 20 minutes to go here. So the Congress passes the IRTPA, and the DNI arguably has less authority than he used to, but he has a mandate, or at least the goals set for him by the WMD Commission and the Intelligence Reform Act and the 9/11 Commission to knock down stovepipes, to find innovative methods to recruit new terrorists, to create a joint duty system so we have more jointness, to facilitate information sharing, to be able to stand up centers and move people and move money, has the DNI, ODNI, in its first 5-6 years before we get to Clapper, did it succeed? Has it been successful?
Kind of. So you got the, let me just parse it out by DNI, all right? So you've got the Negroponte years. So we decide that we're going to have 4 deputies, that they're going to do these things, that we're going to have this shop, we're going to, I mean, this is, I mean, there was nothing on the butcher paper here, people, when we set up. Everything had to be decided. You know, what shade of blue is in the shield? Okay, that was one. It was. So, Mike, I think the credit to Ambassador Negroponte was to actually get this thing running, get physical space, get good people. We're quite successful hiring good people. I mean, we got Ron over here. We cherry-picked Eric Hazeltine from NSA, formerly of Disney Imagineering. I mean, Tom Finger and Dave Shedd and Mary Margaret, good people. Footnote, okay? The DCI controlled more day-to-day collection as DCI than the DNI ever did. Charlie Allen was country before country was cool. Okay? And we still have not yet replicated Charlie Allen's control over integrated collection that he actually did back to DCI and so on. Sorry, I interrupted myself. So we get things underway with Negroponte, and then the Admiral comes in. And I think what the Admiral did was to set, I mean, again, he still had the issues. He had issues with me at CIA. You and I should probably do a tag team about who should be the DNI rep in national capitals. I'll get to that before I'm done. And I probably should have been more generous with him, but, you know, I had my issues trying to win over a workforce that, remember battered child syndrome and so on, so, you know, I had some limits. But what I think the Admiral set in motion were long-term processes that actually changed the character of the community. And they weren't short putts. They were hard to do. The information sharing NID, is that right, NID, National Intelligence Directive? Yeah. The NID on joint duty assignments. You know? I mean, these weren't easily done. But he set in motion these processes that over time have good people converging to the general purpose, the general outcome that the law intended. The FISA fight, again, took that off the head of Keith and allowed Keith to be Dernza while you went ahead and did that at some personal cost. All right? And so I think the McConnell era is identified with that setting in motion long processes. Then Denny comes in, and okay to fast forward?
Oh, yeah.
To Denny, yeah. Okay, so Denny comes in, thinks he's still sync pack, and has trouble adjusting. I don't blame Denny. Denny had really good ideas. All right? I mean, he was really smart and really took the job to heart and really was trying to do some really good things. Hiring Chaz Freeman, all right? You want to shake this place up? Hire Chaz Freeman. Actually, maybe I wouldn't have done it, all right? But I understand what he's trying to do. But he does it without telling Jim Jones or anybody else in the West Wing. Kind of like, and he was never inside the huddle. Remember back to my second criteria, President and DNI, all right? Never inside the huddle. So he was doomed. Okay, so there's 18 months that just nothing happening. So,
Our last question on this, then we'll move on to some other different things. Is there anything, is the country safer because we have a DNI? Has the DNI accomplished things that only the DNI could have done under this current structure that could not have been done under the DCI structure?
It could have been done under the DCI if you accept Don Rumsfeld's formula, which actually is a very good formula, all right? But then that means the personal intervention of the president. I'll sound slightly political here. That would have happened under the 43rd president. That would not happen under the 44th. President Obama isn't interested in the plumbing. All right? He's interested in other things. God bless him. But he's not interested in the plumbing of the IC. George Bush was. So it made it too dependent upon the personality.
So this is a work in progress. You haven't given up on it.
No, not at all. And are we safer? Yeah, we're safer. Some of the things directly attributable to the DNI, things I suggested the Admiral set in motion. Some things as byproducts of the DNI, the NCTC. Byproducts of the DNI. The guy at Langley gets to be the guy at Langley. and to focus on that exclusively. Those are big deals.
What is your, I want to cover a couple of things when you were CIA director here in a minute, but here's a question from the audience. Discuss the DNI Director of FBI relationship, specifically with regard to FBI intelligence reform. The statute is certainly murky on this. Everybody thought that we were making innovations to so-called domestic intelligence post 9/11. Talk a little bit about how you see this and whether any progress has come. Victories and challenges.
I do not think the Bureau yet identifies itself as an intelligence organization.
What can the DNI
You want
do
more?
about that? What can the DNI do about that? Nothing?
Apparently not a hell of a lot. It is really hard, okay? It's countercultural. It's countercultural in the United States because it's domestic intelligence. It's countercultural structurally because no one who's created a domestic intelligence service has thought it a good idea to put it inside the federal police force. Okay? We did that. So really, really hard. Of all the things that the law intended, other than congressional reform, this is probably the one with the lowest quantity of result.
So you often said as CIA director that you felt your job was being the combatant commander in the war on terrorism.
I said it became my job.
Became your job.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, ask your question because there's another factor here.
But when John Brennan was going through his confirmation process, he thought that the community had become too focused on the CT mission and that we missed. Do you agree with the criticism or the critique that we have necessarily or taken our eye off the ball of the rest of the world as we focus too much on the Middle East in the last 10 years? Or was that perfectly appropriate in the 10 years after 9/11 to focus on terrorism?
Right. Both statements are true. We took our eye off the ball, and it was appropriate.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we had to go do. My last meeting with Dave Petraeus before his confirmation, he and Holly came to the house, had breakfast. He took notes. He always takes notes. He was talking to every living former CIA director. We had a nice breakfast, took notes. We're leaving. I do a poolside. Janine and Holly are walking towards the door. Dave, one more thing. And here's the way I put it. And some of you may have heard me say this, but I think it's really, really precisely what I want to say. Dave, CIA has never looked more like OSS than it does right now. And that's a tremendously good thing. America's tremendously safer because of it. But you've got to remember, it's not OSS. It's the nation's global espionage service. And you're going to have to fight every day, the way I did and the way I think Leon did, to remind you and the institution that it's got other stuff out there it's really got to pay attention to. So I agree with John.
Beyond...
By the way, the events of the last 18 months have now recranked that back to say, most policymakers saying, where the hell is OSS?
Right. Beyond the counterterrorism realm, what will be the measure of success for the intelligence community's unity of effort in the strategic future?
Yeah. Isn't that a problem for us, how we measure our success? I mean, it really is. I mean, I often, when people get all skittish about how we treat a detainee as opposed to someone else, and they start bringing in all sorts of law enforcement models about it's suspicionless surveillance or, it's detention without charge. I say, these are all foreign concepts to an intelligence organization. I mean, we're not in business to prove stuff beyond a reasonable doubt. We are in business to enable action in the face of continuing doubt. That's what we do. And so measuring this, Michael, is going to be very hard, but clearly the measurement's in the final product. Are we good at this or not?
I've heard you say many times in the last few years with regard to detainees that you accept that there can be a difference of opinion about whether morally or ethically we should have applied enhanced interrogation techniques, but that the one thing that you cannot sign up to is that they were not effective. You said, I own these facts. The CIA owns these facts. This is not subject to debate. Is there anything that's changed your mind about that recently?
Oh God, no. So let's talk about John's speech yesterday.
Yeah.
All right, which I think was a fine speech. And you all know, I mean, he was trying to thread had about that much space, right? I was on Jake Tapper yesterday talking about rectal rehydration for about 10 minutes. I can follow up on that if anybody is interested.
We have a couple of questions from the audience on that. Yeah.
But they had Evan Perez, who was out at the agency and heard John's speech. And Evan and I talked. He's their justice correspondent. Okay? So Evan and I were talking before we went on stage with Tappert. And Evan told me this privately, and then he said it on the air. He said, Brennan, threading a very narrow space here. Frankly, he sounded a lot more like Dick Cheney on Tuesday than he did like Barack Obama, and so he had to kind of throttle it back in his speech. Now, what John said was, we got valuable, even critical. He used the word critical in a Q&A session, I think. He said valuable and useful in the prepared remark. I mean, imagine how big a staff was out there sandpapering the adverbs in this thing. But he said, I cannot prove that we got this information as a direct result of the EITs. So I figure, I didn't hear John's speech, so I get it tweeted to me or emailed to me, and I'm reading it in the car going to CNN, and I figured, okay, he's going to ask me this question. I got to be on my game. We never got beyond, well, you know what I mean. Okay, we never got beyond rectal stuff. But what I was prepared to say, and I will share with you now, is John went to Fordham, I went to Duquesne. We both know what philosophy courses look like. I'm sure we both took logic courses. What John was saying was the post hoc ergo propter hoc argument is a fallacy in logic. Okay? And so I can accept that. All right? All this stuff was post hoc. I think it was propter hoc, but I understand that post doesn't prove propter. But we can all agree none of this stuff was pre-hoc. It was all post. And that would have been my answer. It's pretty good Latin.
That was good. I'm gonna ask somebody to translate that. So, I want to talk a little bit. I've talked to you through the years about your role, your visions for congressional oversight. I think it's fair to say it's ebbed and flowed through the years.
Using a water metaphor. Interesting.
Yeah. What is your? I mean, overall, should we consider this a great moment of congressional oversight? Because, hey, some people looked and studied a covert action program for 4 or 5 years and wrote a voluminous report that, while maybe didn't get the conclusions right in your sense,
that's actually important.
No, I know, but isn't this an exercise in congressional oversight, or maybe it is and it was too much?
Yeah. I don't have mixed views about this. I have strong views. So you all need to put your filters up here and say, Hayden's mad and so on. My formula before was to be as full Monty with the oversight as possible. The only break we had, and the admirals were this, was what the White House wanted. Recall our drill with Al-Kabar and the Syrian nuclear reactor, and we were confined to briefing the Gang of Eight that, yeah, there's a kind of a nuclear reactor here in Syria, and then the Israelis blow it up, and then the Gang of Eight wants us to tell the rest of the Congress, and the President won't let us. And actually, we're the ones lobbying, which actually is kind of the state of nature. We're the ones lobbying to tell more members because we're going to be here when these guys are gone, or at least our institutions are. So it's very important. So I've always leaned forward. I spent the summer of '06 mastering the RDI program, and then, in essence, discussing with Steve Hadley, the president and the vice president, we've got to go full Monty with the committees. We can't keep this confined to the Gang 8 because what's happening is, it's '06. You're going to be gone. We've got to put this on a sustained political footing, and you can't it can't be just George Bush's program if you want it to continue, if you think it's worth doing. It's got to be America's program, and you can't do that without getting the other political branch on board. So here's the deal. We've got to tell them what we're doing, and then we've got to offer that we can change what we're doing because, well, we've got to be on the same team. So we actually had 13 techniques. We went to 7 on before I even made a proposal to the committee, and by the time we were done, we were at 6. Right? But the committee had nothing to do with it. All right? All they did was yell at me for 2 years. And now you've got this abomination of a report. Right? This is darker angels of my nature coming out. I may change my mind in a year or two, but right now I'm convinced these people cannot be trusted with sharp objects. And therefore, if I were still in government, I would turn to my lawyer and say, what is the minimal requirement of the statute? And that's what I would tell the Congress of the United States.
Did Panetta overdo it by?
Absolutely. But I share blame. The sequence of events is Jose grinds up the tapes. An event, I might add. The tapes are neither created nor destroyed on my watch. Just saying. I'm that guy in that picture behind the circus. And in order to prove there was no malevolence, right, I made the case that these tapes have been viewed by our Inspector General. And our Inspector General has concluded that the cables from the locations are absolutely consistent with the realities as portrayed in the tapes. And if you don't believe me, I can let you see the cables. So I showed him the cables that were about the interrogations of Abu Zubaydah and Nashir. Okay. Leon comes in. Senator Feinstein's now chair of the committee. She says, oh, my God, what I saw on these cables. We want a thorough investigation. And so Leon said, well, I'll give you all the cables, which is an absolutely unprecedented act. They got access to 6 million pages of what you and I would call pre-decisional operations, mouthing off in an email documents. They got it all. And then they went through that, and in my view, said, okay, I got my conclusions here. Let me pick out what I need in 6 million documents. You give me 6 million documents in 5 years, I can prove you killed Jesus. Okay. And that's what they.
You should use that line.
I think I might. I was testing it. I
think it's working.
Yeah. The White House was livid that Leon had opened the coffers like this.
The Obama White House was.
The Obama White House, yeah, the transparent
guys.
Right. Yeah. And there's a long passage in Director Panetta's book where Rahm Emanuel is using monosyllabic words for an extended period of time about why'd you do this? And much to the detriment of the agency, and it's playing out now in real time, Michael, is the White House refused to share these similar documents with the committee because of executive privilege. And so now you've got this mantra out there, the White House didn't know.
Right.
Because the correspondence with the White House has been protected by executive privilege and not shared.
Obama asserting executive privilege on behalf of the Bush White House to
Yeah.
preserve the principle.
Yeah.
All right. 2 more questions. Do you think any policy changes will come as a result of the publication of the Feinstein report? And to build on that, where are you worried that this goes next? Are you worried about reopened prosecutions, decreased risk-taking, morale problems? Where does this no more confidence in the intelligence community after Snowden and after this? Tell me why you're really, really worried in a longer, medium term.
Number one, just a raw, absolute sense of justice. Right? There are a whole bunch of people being hung out to dry who did not just what was permitted by the nation, but frankly, in our hearts of hearts, we wanted them to do. Period. Dot. I actually got a piece I'm going to put in Washington Times in which I said, so why'd you do this? And I talk about expiation of guilt. And allows a certain number of people to say, see, it wasn't us. It was never us. It was them. There's people over there, the ones who lied. This is about them. And I think that's a really strong motivating factor for the report. And the way in which it puts full blame on, I mean, think about what it says. You did it. You went beyond your limits. You consistently lied about it. And it was a rogue operation outside the control of the American government. Where were we?
No, yeah, I'm just.
Oh, changes. Yeah,
policy changes.
I'm sorry.
As a
Yeah,
result.
I got it. So you have this moral offense against the people at the agency. So that's one. Number 2, it's probably going to be a generation or 2 before Case Officer Schmuckatelli raises his hand and says, you know, I've been thinking about this issue. It's kind of edgy here, but you know, I've been thinking, and maybe we ought to. Schmuckatelli ain't raising his hand for a generation and change. Right? Third, our liaison services. Yeah, cooperate with these guys? Yeah, right. We'll do that. Fourth, how many man-decades have been consumed in the last 3 years from the highest level of talent in the Central Intelligence Agency dealing with this process? I mean, it's amazing. I know who's been assigned to it. I mean, they're all first-round draft picks.
Right.
So it's very costly in that regard. There are probably more, but that's enough.
Last question. I've had nothing but great experiences with NIU, particularly when I was on the HIPC and went out there on a number of occasions, and I know you have a similar amount of respect for that institution. But what would you recommend for NIU for the future as an engine of IC integration?
Well, clearly, the restructuring, that it's the big hour, the multiple hour university is the right approach. And that, again, it's a little bit like the admirals changing sharing, changing personnel policies. It sets in motion processes whose effects are predictable but hard to measure but inevitable. So that's all good. It needs to be an agent of innovation, of fresh thinking inside the intelligence community. It's got to be, what universities are on the outside. It's just not. It was never a training facility, but you know what I mean.
Sure.
It's just not about what happens to the graduates in the 10, 12 months they're there, but it's what's the faculty doing to enrich the intellectual capacity of the intelligence community. I mean, we've got the Center for the Studies of Intelligence over at we've got places, but I actually think NIU might be a really good place to have that go on, because we've got some really big issues coming at us. As big a deal as this report is, Michael, as big a deal as Snowden is, they actually might be the flotsam and jetsam here. They may actually not be the real issues. Let me do Snowden. I'll be very efficient. Snowden's effect, not cause. Okay? The cause is changing cultural mores inside the United States about what constitutes legitimate government secrecy. Okay? That's a big deal. Okay? And one that really needs some high-powered intellectual action against it. Another one. We get to talk first at the meetings, and he was very generous. Bob Gates was wrong on this one. We actually both got to go to the meeting. But he let me talk.
There can only be two.
He was first. Actually, it was very confusing. Mike, what do you think?
Yeah.
I was going to say something profound, but it went away. Where was I?
NIU's role in balancing.
Oh, yeah. So we get to talk first at the meeting. Why? Because we lay the groundwork. We create the left and right-hand boundaries of rational conversation. Well, why is that us? Well, it's us because for most of the history of the modern state, just for us kind of post-LU route changes after the Spanish-American War, for most of the history of the modern American state, most of the stuff that set the left and right-hand boundaries, most of the narrative that created the policy conversation was stuff you had to steal. It was stuff that was the product of what we narrowly define as intelligence. That's no longer true. Somebody's still got to set the left and right-hand boundaries. But with each passing day, a larger quotient of that narrative is not comprised of stuff you have to steal. It's readily available stuff. And so if we're going to continue to be the storytellers, we have to make sure we have not defined our job as the teller of secrets. We've defined our job as the teller of the tale. That is a fundamental cultural shift inside the intelligence community, where we give inordinate pride of place to things that we have purloined. And in this new world, we're really going to have to readdress what it is we are. I'll give you another sense, too. and this is a kind of a corollary of that, but it reinforces the primary point. Espionage is no longer a government monopoly. And I purposely do not use the word intelligence. Espionage is no longer a government monopoly. And so there will be other centers of excellence out there that we will have to match in performance. Otherwise, we'll become less and less relevant, and we won't talk first in the room. In fact, we may not even get a ticket. So, I mean, these are really basic things that are changing, that a university that's well schooled in what it is we do might have some real contributions to make.
We're out of time. There was one question for me.
Okay.
Michael Allen, did you call your book Blinking Red because they never let Rudolph play in any reindeer games?
And I thought that was a great metaphor.
Yeah, the answer is yes. General Hayden, you're a true American patriot. It's been an honor to work with you and to be up here with you today. I want to thank Booz Allen, the other sponsors, and the NIUF for such a wonderful kickoff event, and happy holidays.
Three quick things as you're leaving. Box lunches outside. Take one, take two. We have plenty. Secondly, we did videotape this. It'll be on the FCA website and the NIU website, or at least the foundation website. And then lastly, stay tuned for more of the speaker series. Oh, we told you. Yeah, I asked him if it would restrain him, and he said no, not a bit. And stay tuned for more of the speaker series in 2015. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great weekend.